All right, you're watching Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We've been getting these images in. This was posted by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy on social media. He is showing images of the latest attack on Ukrainian energy infrastructure by the Russians. The BBC, with some reporting, they say more than 600,000 people in Kiev, really 500,000 in Kiev, and then another 100,000 people in the wider region, according to the BBC, are without power on Saturday morning after an overnight Russian attack. Ukraine's energy ministry attributing the power losses to missiles and drone strikes on energy infrastructure in the city and several other regions. The BBC, citing local authorities, says that around 36 missiles and nearly 600 drones were launched on targets across Ukraine overnight, killing 3 people and injuring dozens of others. Hal Kempfer, still here with us. He's the host of the Strat podcast. Hal, when we look at an attack like this, hitting energy infrastructure carries weight, but does it carry a little extra weight when we're heading into wintertime?
Well, it has a huge weight and on multiple levels. First off, this is not the first time. This war's been going on for almost 4 years. And this is not the first time the Russians have said, let's hit their energy infrastructure and literally freeze the population. You know, let that winter that's so famous in Ukraine and Russia, let them do the work for us. And of course, the Russians are very famous for using winter as a military tool in previous wars. In fact, all the previous wars, I think. So that's why their focus is on hitting energy infrastructure. And of course, they look at energy infrastructure where it will take the Ukrainians a long time to rebuild so they can get the most lasting destructive force impact on society as part of this. That's one level. There's another level, which is a political level, and that is this corruption issue that's going on. You know, you have Andrei Yermak, the President Zelensky's chief of staff, just had to resign Friday. He was leading the peace negotiations. He was leading the Geneva delegation that met with the U.S. over there. He was supposed to lead the delegation coming to the U.S. this week that was going to talk about possible proposal for peace or at least a ceasefire in that war. And he's out. He's completely out. Why? Because he's tied to this corruption scandal involving about $100 billion in the energy infrastructure and their energy infrastructure ministry. And this brings it right, not just near Zelenskyy, but right next to Zelenskyy. And so by hitting this energy infrastructure, it accentuates the point. Think of all that corruption, think of all that lost investment that could have gone to reinforcing the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. So it kind of reinforces a political point. Don't think that for 1 second is lost on the Kremlin. That is part of their psychological operations against the Ukrainian population.
So this is what Zelenskyy posted on social media. I'll read this out. He describes some of the impacts of the attacks. He says, in the Kyiv and in the region, our emergency services are working at the sites of the Russian strikes. The Russians have launched about 36 missiles and almost 600 drones against ordinary life. The main targets of the attack were energy infrastructure and civilian facilities, with extensive damage and fires in residential buildings. We currently have reports of dozens injured and 3 killed. My condolences to their families and loved ones. We must work without wasting a single day to ensure that there are enough missiles for our aid defense systems and that everything necessary for our protection and for pressure on Russia is in place. It is time that Europe made a decision on the frozen assets if Moscow refuses to end its drone and missile strikes, and we must certainly discuss with all partners the steps needed to bring this war to an end. Thank you to everyone who is helping. Hal, if you could clarify one thing within that post there. Zelenskyy says it's time that Europe made a decision on the frozen assets. What assets is he alluding to?
Well, there's about 300 billion or more frozen Russian assets around the world. Most of them are in Europe, and most of those are in Europe are actually in Belgium. And these are various things, ownership of real property, bank account, you name it, all sorts of frozen assets. Anyway, it's a big chunk of change. What has been happening till now is they've been basically using the profit from those assets to pay for a variety of things. There's a proposal out there to use the assets as collateral for loans to buy military support and other things for Ukraine. And that's going after the principal itself. And then that's supposed to be repaid when the Russians pay for rebuilding Ukraine, which I think most people recognize the Russians probably will never do. So it'll be simply written off and they'll seize the assets at that point. The problem is about 200 to 220 billion of those assets primarily are held in Belgium, and that's where the Russians preferred to hold their assets at. And Belgium actually is making a significant amount of tax revenue off of these assets, and so Belgium has been dragging their feet. And this gets into, their sovereign country. They have the right to do this. They have been dragging their feet on using these assets or liquidating these assets, because once they liquidate those assets, they can no longer tax those assets, and that ends that tax revenue that they've been enjoying, which has been able to augment their national budget. I know it sounds really, pardon the expression, but it sounds a little selfish, and that's kind of how the other European countries look at it, which is they're all kind of looking at Belgium right now saying, hey, look, you've got to step up and do something for the European Union and for NATO here. You've got to make a decision. But the internal politics within Belgium are such that people like the fact that they're getting this tax revenue that really doesn't impact the Belgian citizenry or Belgian businesses. They're able to get it from the Russians, and they don't want to liquidate that because they don't want to lose that tax revenue. But the pressure is building, and that's why you saw President Zelenskyy weighing in on this issue, which is it's time to do it, because there is consensus amongst the European nations. It's time to liquidate. It's time to use those assets to pay for the war. And Belgium is kind of dragging its feet on this because of that very, very, very national centered revenue issue.
So, how would you define? People always ask me for an update on the battlefield. How would you define Russia's offensive efforts as of late? How would you define Ukraine's defensive efforts as of late? Who has the upper hand on the battlefield?
Well, I'll say this, the Ukrainian defense is absolutely superlative. They have been just doing some amazing work out there thwarting these Russian attacks. And the Russians have been throwing everything they possibly can. And despite this huge narrative, this information operation put out by the Kremlin, that, they're going to take Donetsk Oblast by force, and they're going to take all the Donbass, and ultimately the Ukrainians can do nothing but lose. And unfortunately, that narrative has taken hold with some of the thinking in Washington, D.C. The reality is anything but that. Right now, there is no imminent threat that Russia will take over Donetsk Oblast. They might take over Pokrovsk at some point. They've certainly thrown enough resources out there, although that has become just a blood-soaked battlefield for the Russians. Their tactics are inane. They still do these meat wave attacks where they take poorly trained soldiers and they just use them as frontal assault infantry, and they just get wiped out. And the Russians are basically pulling from every part of society. They've been pulling from prisons for quite some time. Now they apparently are grabbing drunks out of bars, and some of the drunks can barely stand up. And they say, "Raise your right hand," swear them into the military, send them off for a few weeks of training. Next thing you know, they're carrying a on what for the Ukrainians would be the Eastern Front, fighting the Ukrainians and getting hit with machine guns and mortars and drones. So they've not been making a lot of progress across the board. In fact, some of the Ukrainian counterattacks have been rather successful despite this enormous amount of Russian manpower and equipment that's being thrown up against them. So it's kind of a static front line for the most part, but the Ukrainians desperately need more ammunition or weapons, and they got to do something about their manpower thing. That's a huge problem. Right now, they don't not have compulsory service until someone hits the age of 25. Everyone's been looking at this and telling them, whatever this, I call coffee clutch concept, where you're sitting around going, well, give them a chance to live their lives and whatever. It's like you're fighting for the survival of your nation. Every other country, you'll find that the compulsory service usually starts somewhere between ages 18 and 20. That's the norm. They've got this very strange thing, and they need that manpower on the front lines. They need to get more soldiers in uniform out there in the trenches, so to speak, and doing what needs to be done. And that's just a Ukrainian cultural issue that they've got to work through.
So I guess another big picture question that a lot of people have now that the U.S. has been leading efforts to reach a peace deal, especially in recent weeks. Who has more leverage at this point, Hal? The Russians or the Ukrainians in the bigger picture?
You know, it's interesting. The Russians obviously have quite a bit of leverage with the White House 28-point plan. And we saw the stuff where Witkoff, the intercepted phone conversation where Witkoff was coaching the Russians on how to convince Trump to go along with the Russian position. I just find that an absolutely fascinating situation, and I don't know why the president doesn't tell Witkoff to move along and get somebody else in there, but that was that's that. So they have a lot of influence there. The other side, though, is the Europeans, and the Europeans are looking at this and realizing they've been completely sidelined. And and nothing builds unity like a common enemy. And in this case, the common enemy was Russia, but now they're looking at Washington, D.C. and saying, Washington, D.C. doesn't really have our backs. They don't seem to be too concerned about European security issues. And European security issues are tied to Russia and tied to making sure the Ukrainians don't fall to a Russian military invasion. And so the Europeans are actually galvanizing around this, and there's a lot of introspection on this, which is, can Europe rise to the occasion? Can they manifest all their divergent interests in divergent countries into this common purpose of resisting this threat in Russia and dealing with this uncertainty about the U.S. commitment to European security? So there's another side to this entirely, which I find absolutely fascinating. And I think that in the long run may be the bigger issue we look at, which is a resurgent Europe that is pursuing its own interests separate and apart from whatever the U.S. wants to do.
Hal Kemper's a retired Marine intelligence officer, the host of the Strat podcast as well. Hal, what's the most recent episode of Strat about, and what's coming up on Strat?
Well, this will sound a little odd, but the most recent episode was talking about the fires, which you were very familiar with because you were out there for the Palisades and Eaton fires. And some of these things coming out were, there were state officials that basically knew there was a problem up there above the Palisades and had deliberately quashed doing some things and had misstated some of the response assets that they'd sent down, exaggerated some of the response assets they'd sent down before, and gets into all the problems, all the issues, and then going back into some of the longer issues that they've had with fire mitigation, fire preparedness, and natural disaster preparedness in California, with some distinctive political implications as to why that has happened, and not along with just the damages. This next issue, though, this next one coming out this weekend, I'm going to really focus on what's going on with Russia, Europe, and the whole Ukrainian thing, the 28-point proposal, but also the back and forth, and get into the dynamics, because this is pretty complex. And so I'm going to try and unravel, or unfold, I should say, some of the details in that to make it kind of more understandable as to what is exactly happening as people are rushing from the Middle East to Moscow, to Kyiv, to Geneva, to Washington, D.C., with these various meetings and negotiations.
Hal Kemper joining us for a marathon. We went 50 minutes today, Hal. We'll see you soon. Thanks for coming on. Hal and Strat can be listened to anywhere podcasts are available, any single platform you can think of. Hal, good to see you. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Austin. Have a great weekend.
You too. While we're talking about Ukraine, let's show the latest from Vladimir Zelenskyy. He sent this out within the past few hours. He's talking about the ongoing peace discussions here stateside. Zelenskyy says the Ukrainian delegation should already be in the United States by this evening, U.S. time. The dialogue based on the Geneva points will continue. Diplomacy remains active. The American side is demonstrating a constructive approach, and in the coming days, it is feasible to flesh out the steps to determine how to bring the war to a dignified end. The Ukrainian delegation has the necessary directives, and I expect the guys to work in accordance with clear Ukrainian priorities. Zelenskyy attaching a video update to this post. He speaks in Ukrainian. It has English subtitles. Let's play the full thing out. It's about 3 minutes long.
Шановні українці і українки, зараз ще тривають роботи після нічного удару російських ракет і дронів. Масштабний був удар. Енергетика – основна ціль. Тут Росія не змінює свою тактику і досі намагається завдати Україні саме такого болю перед зимою. Важливо, що ми протидіємо, важливо, що є збиття. 19 ракет вдалося збити, серед них балістика. Подавлено також майже 560 безпілотників, серед яких близько 300 шахеди. На жаль, не все було збито, і працювати для більш сильної ППО – це пріоритет номер один. Це завдання надзвичайно складне, надзвичайно дороге для України та партнерів. Будь-яка країна не витягнула би це самотужки, але ми забезпечуємо Україні ракети для протиповітряної оборони та постійно збільшуємо парк наших систем ППО різних типів. Готуємось до роботи на наступному тижні з нашими партнерами, в тому числі заради більш якісної нашої протиповітряної оборони. Дуже розраховуємо на сприяння партнерів. Сьогодні ввечері за американським часом українська делегація вже має бути в Сполучених Штатах Америки і буде продовжений діалог на основі пунктів з Женеви. Дипломатія залишається активною. Американська сторона проявляє конструктив і цілком реально найближчими днями доопрацювати кроки, щоб визначити, як достойно закінчити війну. Українська делегація має необхідні директиви. І я очікую від хлопців роботу згідно з чіткими українськими пріоритетами. Сьогодні ж були наради з Кирилом Будановим, також з Денисом Шмигалем, також з Михайлом Федоровим, також з Павлом Палісою. Кожна з цих нарад про різні аспекти нашої внутрішньої стійкості, ну і, звісно, про ту нашу силу, яка може допомогти правильним перемовинам. Говорив зі спікером Верховної Ради України Русланом Стефанчуком, представниками фракції більшості та з прем'єр-міністром України Юлією Свериденко. Я розраховую, що парламент України буде працездатним. Є кандидатура на міністра юстиції вже. Потрібне і чітке бачення щодо очільника Міністерства енергетики України. Сильна людина потрібна. Попросив парламентарів разом із прем'єр-міністром визначити перелік кандидатур. І ще одне. Будуть нові наші санкційні рішення. В розвиток тиску партнерів на Росію за цю війну. І наші санкції, які ми будемо робити фактично спільними з нашими партнерами, щоб світ тиснув на агресора саме так, як це потрібно для послаблення російської здатності воювати. Укази будуть завтра. Наші пропозиції санкцій будуть передані в усі сильні партнерські юрисдикції. Дякую кожному, хто допомагає. Дякую всім, хто захищає Україну. Слава Україні!
And we will, of course, keep you posted on any major developments that come out of the ongoing peace discussions, some of those taking place here stateside. Zelenskyy says that his delegation arrived, or will be arriving tonight, that is, Saturday evening, as we do this broadcast. The time in the nation's capital, 2:52. Let's hit a break. Our final